So welcome to this podcast where we're going to talk about some of the emerging scams and frauds which have occurred in the coronavirus crisis that we're currently sitting through. I've got two very distinguished guests, Jim G from Crowe and Rebecca Fitzhugh from Sobelco. I'll just hand over to introduce them. So Jim, perhaps if you could say a bit about yourself first of all.
Yeah, I'm a partner. I'm head of forensic services for Crowe UK. I've been working in this area now for more than 25 years. I'm also chair of the Centre for Counter Fraud Studies, Mark, as you know, at the University of Portsmouth.
Rebecca, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Rebecca Fitzhugh, and I am the partner in charge of the forensic accounting group at Sobel & Company, a CPA firm, certified public accounting firm and consulting firm in New Jersey in the United States. And I've been in the fraud and forensic accounting area for about 16 years.
So today we're going to look at the emerging scams and frauds which we are starting to see in this crisis. And both of you obviously working at the coalface of dealing with frauds and scams. And I just wondered if you could perhaps talk us through some of the particular frauds and scams related to the coronavirus that you have witnessed over the last few weeks. So Jim, first perhaps you could go first.
Well, there's been numerous COVID-19 specific healthcare scams. Things like fake cures, protective equipment for sale that actually isn't delivered, fake virus tracking scams, which is bad enough, all of that. But what really concerns me is the more general economic crisis-driven fraud and cybercrime. And as more people, especially at senior levels with the authority to do real damage, come under financial pressure, they will be reevaluating loyalties and doing things to protect their financial positions, which they would not have contemplated in normal times. And I think that's an internal and external problem. And I think there's probably three main areas. So we're seeing a growth in the number of people who, as they are being made redundant, or when they think they'll be made redundant, are stealing data and intellectual property so they have something to bring to prospective future employers in the hope of being given new jobs. We're also seeing many more supplier frauds, with invoices being submitted for goods and services never ordered or never delivered, and more fraud involving fraudulent change of bank account details. And the third massive problem has been a real spike in cybercrime, and the combination of hastily created remote working arrangements, which have left gaps in cybersecurity, and some organized crime groups, because of their disruption to their normal drug manufacturing and distribution networks, redirecting greater resources to cybercrime. So it's a bit of a perfect storm, really.
Yeah, that sounds terrible. And Rebecca, what about New York? What are we seeing in New York in terms of this?
I'd have to say that I don't think that there's anything entirely different from what Jim is seeing. In fact, just this week, the Department of Homeland Security here in the U.S. Arrested a man in Georgia for having tried to scam the Department of Veterans Affairs into paying $750 million for 125 million masks that did not even exist.
Yeah.
So definitely these people are out there taking advantage of everybody else's difficulties right now, which is such a pity. But pretty much I think everything that Jim says is the same here as well, even to the point where most states here are creating COVID-19 fraud task forces to work with the Federal Department of Justice in order to track down these schemes and try to prevent and catch the people who are in the midst of committing these crimes and trying to take advantage of people in this terrible time.
That's really interesting. What about frauds specifically targeting organizations and companies? Are there any examples that you can describe from that area over the last few weeks? Perhaps Rebecca, if you go first for this one.
Sure. Well, obviously organizations, and Jim alluded to this before, suddenly people are working from home, and in a number of situations, this wasn't something that an organization was prepared to do in the first place. And so people have been quickly getting hardware to their employees so they can work from home, but maybe they haven't had a chance to, determine whether their work from home situations are secure enough. And, are you using a secure Wi-Fi network? Are you sharing files in a secure enough way that other people aren't going to be able to siphon them off and break into your own systems? So I think that you even have the example of people Zoom bombing and breaking into Zoom meetings. And so that's, that can be a fairly light way of a cybercrime happening. But then I think that you are going to have a large issue with especially the business email compromise scams, where the fraudsters are sending emails to individuals at a company and asking them to transfer money to a specific bank account, let's say. And right now, I think that's a perfect time for these scams to be perpetrated, because people are in a perfect position. They're at home. They're not right next door in an office to somebody to check these requests out. And because the circumstances of this situation are so unusual, they are getting unusual requests by email. And so they may be more likely to comply and go through with it without going through the appropriate channels to confirm that some of these requests are correct. And also because, again, many different emails and instructions are coming out because everybody's working from home, I think that there are more opportunities for people to be vulnerable to clicking on attachments that then are transmitting malware to their own computer systems at home. So I think that those are things that maybe people haven't been educated well enough on yet in the home environment. And because of the circumstances that are going on right now, they're far more vulnerable to falling victim to these types of scams.
Yeah.
And Jim, what about the UK context? Anything different from what Rebecca has said?
No, it's interesting. Two countries, but really, it shows how homogenous the problem of fraud is. It's, wherever it takes place, they exploit the same things. Lots of anxious people, distracted, new working arrangements at home. All of those things are opportunities to these people. We're starting to see some real worries from some of our clients. They're profiling the highest risk people, highest risk areas in their business, externally and internally. And internally, they're starting to realize that actually there are people with considerable authority to make payments perhaps, or do things that would cost their firm substantial amounts, who themselves are under serious financial pressure. I can think of one client organization where literally one of the senior people there is living from a month to a month basis. So if he had gone without his salary for a month, he would have needed to do something extraordinary to actually deal with that financial pressure. I can think of another client where when they started looking at high risk people internally, they found out actually he had a serious gambling habit. Wow. So, there are a lot of things which people are becoming aware of that in normal times, perhaps they didn't need to know, but they do know now, and it's making them very worried because they can see the potential for all sorts of problems.
Mm-hmm. Now, the virus looks like it's going to be followed by a pretty sharp and deep recession. And we know from the research that we've done that in past recessions, that has led to an increase in fraud. What do you think is going to happen over the next 2 or 3 years as a result of what seems like a very, sharp downturn in economic activity?
Do you want me to take that one first, Mark?
Jim, yes.
Well, as you know, Crowe and the University of Portsmouth manage the world's largest database concerning the extent and cost of fraud. and that's 21 years of data from 40 sectors, different countries, including the UK and the US, a lot of data from the US, and covering almost 20 trillion sterling of expenditure, so a massive database. But what the latest research focused on was the extent to which reported fraud increases as GDP and the economy shrinks in the first stages of a recession. And we look back at the last three big UK recessions in 1980, 1990, 91, and 2008, 2009. And we reviewed the Office for National Statistics data concerning the shrinkage in the economy, shrinkage of GDP, in the first 3 quarters of each of those recessions. And we compared them with the UK government's data on reported fraud. And there was a very clear correlation. In simple terms, if the UK economy in this current recession shrinks by 15% in the second quarter of 2020, as many analysts predict, and indeed they predict more than that, then it's likely that fraud will increase by over 60% in the UK. If it shrinks by 25%, and that's actually slightly less than currently envisaged by our government, then it will increase by over 100%. And that would mean that fraud would be at levels unprecedented in my lifetime. And I think it's highly likely that most organizations' protection against fraud will be ineffective to some extent, or at least it will be ineffective unless it's reviewed and seriously ramped up.
Mm-hmm. And Rebecca, America also looks like it's going to go into a recession as well as a result of this. What do you think the implications are for America in terms of the likely recession?
Right. So, we all know that in good times, money hides a lot of problems, right? So, definitely I expect that fraud will increase. You're going to have a lot of people who are in desperate situations and will end up doing things that they would not normally do in terms of improper activity in order to get themselves through a rough economic time. And, you may have an employee who can't pay their mortgage, but if they're in a position in accounts payable or in an accounting or finance department, they may be tempted to write a check to themselves or to their mortgage company when they would never do that before. And these types of times in desperation also make people much more vulnerable to these offers of, incredible investment returns or other types of rewards that are just too good to be true, that we all know that in those cases that's not the right thing. And one of my biggest worries, though, is that organizations are so caught up right now with making sure that, understanding the economic stimulus packages that are out there, they're being offered, and how are they going to comply with requirements, and how are they going to, keep their employees paid and their businesses going, that I think that fraud detection and prevention is not going to be top of mind for them. And while they should be implementing programs to protect themselves, I think that that's going to be low on the totem pole, and they're going to have some major problems because they are not focusing on that.
Mm. Which brings me to the next subject in terms of what organizations should be doing. Perhaps you could go into a bit more depth, Rebecca, in terms of the key things you think organizations should be doing now for the crisis and the medium term when the recession strikes.
Sure. So regardless of the economic environment, all organizations should be very proactive about implementing programs that deter and detect fraud. It's always cheaper to do that and less expensive to do that proactively than to react to a fraud that has happened and try to recover the losses. So this type of preparation includes fostering a culture of accountability and integrity within the organization from the highest levels down, because a poor tone at the top always filters down to lower levels and encourages fraud and improper behavior. There also needs to be an environment where organizations are educating their employees about fraud. How do you recognize fraud? What is fraud? And how do you report it? Because the majority of frauds are uncovered by tips, and people need to understand what fraud means within their organization and how to report it, and they need to feel safe in reporting it as well. So implementing a whistleblower program where people can understand who to report a fraud to, and understand also that there will be no retaliation for a good faith report of a suspicion, are all very important things that organizations need to do. And also making sure that internal controls that are allegedly in place are actually being enforced. Internal controls and lack thereof are the cause of majority of frauds. And, you know, as I always say, trust is not an internal control. And everybody needs to be subject to the same internal controls and the same accountability.
That's very interesting. What about you, Jim? Is there anything more you could add on what organizations should be doing?
I think there's a number of things which organizations need to do. One is to agree with Rebecca, really. Existing controls are not very effective against such a rapidly evolving threat as fraud, even at the best of times. So certainly at this time of a massively heightened threat, they need to be radically reviewed and strengthened. I also think there's a kind of two aspects of human behavior which need to be worked on. We need to communicate messages to strengthen a culture of integrity, and also that's about mobilizing the honest majority, if you like. And we also need to be communicating messages to deter the dishonest minority. I think organizations need to review areas of high risk with no sacred cows, incidentally, and that's both internally and externally, and that's about profiling people and suppliers. I think they need to apply advanced data science techniques to detect anomalous behavior and payments. I think they need to make sure they have, and this is crucial and not something maybe many organizations have thought of yet, but they need to make sure they have access to a capacity to undertake lawfully proper remote investigations. And that's in the context of the current social and physical distancing rules. So they need to be able to make sure they can, if necessary, take forensically proper copies of computers, that they can interview witnesses and suspects via video link. And lastly, I think they need to make sure they have access to information and intelligence as the threat of fraud develops and evolves across the economy. It's doing that very rapidly at the moment. So they need to make sure they're plugged into those networks to make sure they are aware of the latest types and threats of fraud.
Okay. Now, another very important issue in the UK at the moment is the government's commitment to expand construction projects. Just before the crisis unfolded, the government had committed to over £600 billion worth of expenditure on various types of construction projects, and most saliently the high-speed rail network, which could potentially cost over £100 billion. Now, these projects are notorious for high levels of fraud, 10% plus, not unusual. Now, Rebecca, you have a unique insight on these types of projects and the frauds that could occur. I wonder if you could talk us through some of the things that you've come across in the past that the UK government should be aware of.
Right. So construction is a notoriously, unfortunately, corrupt industry. And in particular, in the New York area, it has always been, there's been a lot of organized crime influence, and so there has been a number of efforts to try to mitigate those influences. So without programs to deter and detect fraud, waste, and abuse in construction programs, you will typically find multiple frauds, which begin with the procurement stage of the project when you are letting contracts, and those are schemes like bid rigging and pay to play and other corruption schemes. when the project continues, you'll then also have ghost employees. You can have inflation of wages and hours, use of substandard materials, shortcuts on safety measures, collusion amongst contractors and suppliers, kickbacks, bribes, involving all number and level of individuals who might be involved in the project, from government officials right down to the laborers. So every part of a construction project is vulnerable to some sort of fraud and corruption. And as Jim mentioned, you have to mobilize that honest majority and try to deter that dishonest minority in terms of construction projects. And I think, especially given the current economic environment right now, and we had just spoken about possibly going into economic recessions, it's going to be very important for contracting firms to win contracts on these major construction projects. And so it's very possible that they might be incented to commit some sort of fraud in order to win a project, because they obviously want to keep their companies alive and operating. So that's going to lead to things like underbidding projects, and then which leads to change orders down the road, or use of substandard materials, or corners being cut and projects not being built to specifications. And the government needs to make sure that the contractors it is going into business with have a degree of financial health, because it happened at the World Trade Center, and it happens probably on every major construction project, is that major contractors end up financially insolvent, and then the project owner has to either replace them or somehow subsidize them, and that increases the cost of the project. So there are a lot of areas where, especially in the situation right now, they're going to have to be very careful and be very wary of what is happening with contractors behind the scenes.
Thank you. And Jim, you must have a lot of experience of these types of projects. What more could you add on that?
I don't think I've had quite the experience Rebecca has, and I fantastically interesting listening to the kind of detailed knowledge she has in terms of big infrastructure projects. But as a former UK senior civil servant, I have seen up close how government deals with these issues, and I think there's probably 3 points that need to be made. First, they over-focus on delivering the project rather than on protecting the enablers, in this case the money and resource needed to build HS2. So they're focused on the outcome, but not necessarily the things that make that outcome happen. Secondly, I think there's sometimes a belief that when you outsource something to the private sector, then the risk is outsourced too, and it isn't. Responsibility for the whole of the project means just that, protecting all of the resources that are involved. And I think thirdly, the fragmentation of large projects such as this means that there is a need for overarching arrangements to protect all elements against fraud and corruption. Fraudsters always look to exploit the gaps between different organisations. And I think our government, the UK government, needs a different way of thinking about large projects, perhaps not just thinking about it, but a different way of acting about large projects.
Now, one of the interesting things that has emerged in America is the integrity monitors. And these seem to be a very useful and effective way of dealing with fraud and corruption in these types of projects. Rebecca, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about them and your view on the difference they can make in terms of tackling these types of problems.
Right. So, and what Jim just said is exactly one of the reasons why an integrity monitor is a good idea to have on a large public project. Many governmental agencies who are overseeing construction projects don't have the staff, the knowledge, or the budgets to be able to really oversee it in the way it needs to be overseen. They let other people have part of the ability to oversee things, and they trust other people to do it, and that doesn't always work. So the idea of an integrity monitoring team comes in as an extension of government oversight. You have a dedicated team of people who really get involved deeply in a construction project and know all of the different aspects of the project that are happening. They are able to reduce fraud and corruption by working with both the government entity as well as the contractors, the laborers, et cetera, to identify the risks that are inherent in a particular construction project. And they are able to really, spend more time with the project than a government agency is able to do. They bring in people who are in a number of different areas. So an integrity monitoring team will typically have auditors, forensic accountants, engineers, lawyers, people from all different areas that can put together the ideas and the experience they have in former projects to really uncover the risks that a government agency may not understand in a construction project. For instance, it was the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey that was overseeing the construction at one World Trade Center and the other World Trade Center sites, but they're a transit authority. They're not, aren't in the business of building skyscrapers. So they didn't necessarily have the experience on hand to be able to understand what were the risks of building a skyscraper, what were the risks of building so many different construction projects on a 16-acre site where you had subway lines going underneath skyscrapers that were the highest in the country at that time. You bring in a special team of people with the experience to deal with those issues, and that is their main goal, is to oversee that project. And you have a much deeper level of experience and collaboration, and they're working with the people on site as well to avoid the circumstances that allow fraud and corruption to get a toehold in the first place. They're not just there to, in a gotcha capacity, to catch people committing fraud, but they're there to try to prevent it in the first place.
Mm-hmm. And that perhaps is the fundamental difference between this role and external audit. And I know some people I've spoken to who don't really, haven't really looked at this in depth, have suggested this is just slightly more intensive external audit. I mean, could you just sort of make clear this is a kind of fundamentally different approach to kind of souped up audit?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, when I think audit, an auditor drops in on a project from time to time. They are not monitoring it constantly. They are not on the ground talking with the construction managers, and they don't have people on the ground doing surveillance. One of the major parts of the World Trade Center monitorship was that we had people on site in intelligence capacities. Everybody knew who they were, but they were right there working along with the construction workers, finding tips, understanding, what the issues were, helping to escalate issues to higher levels and get things resolved before they turned into problems. When you have an entire team coming from different disciplines who understand all of the complexities of a project like this, you're getting a much more broad-based monitoring and oversight than you can with just an auditor who's really just looking at the finances most of the time. a monitoring team is looking at every aspect from, whether the engineers are doing the right thing, whether the testing companies are performing the proper tests on the high strength concrete that has never been used before, whether there's going to be a labor action that could totally interrupt the flow of a construction project in the timeline. You have people who are far more involved in the project. And granted, it is an expensive proposition to have an integrity monitor who is doing a good job, but it probably is a lot more worth it than letting a construction project run wild and letting problems happen that you are not able to address and head off before they actually happen.
Mm-hmm. Now, given the costs of fraud and corruption in these areas has often been found to be around 10%, it would seem to be good value to me. Jim, based upon your experience of government, do you think this kind of role could work in the UK? Do you think the government would be likely to be interested in such a role?
What Rebecca says is so powerful and true. I think that this is exactly what the UK needs and indeed has done for many years. The quicker that the government gets this, the quicker we shall see the vast public funds invested in HS2 properly protected and losses to fraud prevented, so the money can be spent on other public priorities. And I just think that's the least that the UK public would expect.
Okay, thank you very much.